I'm Big Don Luca, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
Now we are on YouTube as well as our normal podcast listening platforms. So for those of you regularly listening on, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever it may be, you probably don't understand what we're talking about right now because you can't see us. But for those of you who are listening to our first YouTube podcast, we welcome you here. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at mainstream_Mavs. We have everything linked down below. But today we are going to be getting into some overarching themes to pull from the first 34 games from the Mavericks this season. We'll be getting into Christian Wood's potential contract extension or non-contract extension, how he's fared in this recent stretch, some trade target teams that we could see the Mavericks potentially negotiate as we approach the deadline. We'll also be looking at if the Mavericks even have the assets to pull it off. And we're also going to be looking at the archetype. What kind of player does the Mavericks need to really amplify and bolster their roster, right? Do they even have the assets to get it? Like I just mentioned a second ago, who knows? We'll be talking very idealistically in that segment. But of course, do the Mavericks even have the luxury to operate under an idealistic sense? Who knows? Probably not, right? So we'll be getting into that. We're going to be looking at the next 10 games in this whole January stretch, how we predict the Mavericks to fare. We'll be looking a little bit ahead to the end of the season. Not like anything extreme or highly intricate, but we will kind of give a little tentative projection in terms of how the Mavericks are going to fare by the end of the year and how they are going to finish in the Western Conference standings. And then we're going to do a little debrief on every single player so far this season. Even those who were once a Maverick and are now not a Maverick anymore. So that includes the famed Tyler Dorsey and Facu Campazzo. I almost cuss every time I say Facu on this podcast, and it's completely incidental. It's not by choice. So we're going to be getting into all of these sort of big picture topics since we unfortunately had, we talked about it glowingly in our last podcast, but we had a little bit of a dry spell there. So that's kind of why we're doing this. We were originally kind of going to postpone this podcast to about halfway through the season. We still may do another one kind of like this halfway through the season, but we wanted to get this out for the games that we unfortunately were not able to cover. But before we do all of that, and this is not going to apply to those of you on YouTube, you will not have to hear this ad. I'm only going to say this one time. But before we do that, here is an ad from our sponsor, Anchor. All right, Jaren, so getting into it, the last 10 games, obviously we've been kind of hard-pressed to cover here over at mainstream_Mavs. But what has been your summation of the last 10 games? We saw Kemba Walker incorporated into the rotation a bit. Then subsequently, these last two games, he's kind of been hurt, and they've been trying to, well, not hurt, but they've been managing his knee. And, we have all the narratives regarding how much you can actually play him and if, his knee is just going to be too much to bear for him to even get a 15 to 20 minutes consistently on a nightly basis. We obviously saw Christian Wood get incorporated into the starting lineup in this recent stretch. Admittedly, it was because of injuries to Maxi Kleber and Dwight Powell at the time. We saw Christian Wood start in Minnesota, but he's been starting for about 3 or 4 games now. Plethora of Mavericks are hurt. Josh Green has a right elbow sprain, and he is to be reevaluated here in a few days, I believe. But he's been out for 2+ weeks now. Obviously, Maxi Kleber tore his right hamstring, and he's going to be out for 6 to 8 weeks. That was about a week ago. Dorian's dealing with some hip abductor stuff right now. Frank is dealing with some left knee soreness. But the Mavericks somehow, despite most of their losses and, even their wins in this stretch being ugly, they've kind of been able to remediate some of these injury woes throughout this last 10-game stretch. And, they're at least treading water. They're 18-16. They're slightly over 500. obviously not where we were hoping they would be at this juncture of the season, not some sort of idealistic place. And I'm not trying to vouch that they're going to end up higher than where they're at right now. Currently, I believe they're 7th in the West.
So, yeah, 7th.
Yeah. So, I mean, who knows if they can actually finish higher than that? We've talked ad nauseum about how kind of mediocre this roster is and how limited they are in terms of trying to improve or, just improving internally with what they have until some of, Josh Green and Jaden Hardy really start to hit that developmental peak, right? But what has been your summation of these last 10 games amidst kind of everything I just mentioned?
Yeah, so I mean, the last 10 games, the Mavericks, of course, 5-5 in this stretch. I think there's some losses here that are kind of, I mean, like the Chicago loss didn't have Luka. I mean, that was just overall a bad game, a weird game as well. Cleveland, we lose 90-105 and just pretty much a game where we're dominated. And then the Minnesota game, 116-106. Like those are 3 losses right there. I think that the Mavericks were just pretty much outclassed in. And again, yeah, what you mentioned, with sort of these past 5 recent games with this, what are they, 3-2 in this stretch. But for 4 games now, I believe it is. I think it was the first Minnesota game they inserted Christian Wood in the starting lineup due to injury, of course, but it seemingly worked out. They're 3-1 with Christian Wood in the starting lineup because I believe it was that first Minnesota game. But nonetheless, I think Christian Wood during the media day, he mentioned Christmas is kind of where you find your identity. Christmas is kind of where you find what team you really have. And I don't want to say that we found this team at all because, to be honest, 18-16, and it's just been such a rocky season. I can't say, you don't know your team's identity at this point. But, we're on a 3-win streak, building off a win on Christmas, or I guess we should see if we can build off that win. I just think, the overall summation of the last 10 games is, I feel like it's trending upward, but I don't want to say that yet because, again, we felt like this once before and we followed that up with like a 4-game losing streak.
No, 100%. I would definitely concur with you there because, you have to look at the ways that the Mavericks have won these last 10 games, of course. And I mean, if we look at just the last 3 games specifically, I mean, we obviously had that insane Luka 50-point plus performance versus the Rockets, where he basically had to carry the Mavericks against one of the worst teams in the league to even get over the hump. The Mavericks in the previous game had a really kind of ugly win over the Timberwolves after that home and home with them, and a really ugly loss beforehand. And then that Lakers win was really emblematic of the whole live and die by the 3 agenda that the Mavericks have, where they just flip the script completely in the second half and start, positively regret. They have insane positive regression from 3 and just their 3-point trajectory just goes through the roof in the second half. And, that was a large part to why they won that game. They were able to force some turnovers and do some other things, but I mean, that was obviously the main reason. So there haven't really been like any sort of statement games or games that I feel like I've learned anything from this roster, really barring that second Cleveland game where everybody to an extent was out and Kemba Walker, ended up scoring 32 points in like 40 minutes or whatever it was. And obviously that was not ideal in terms of his knee health and everything. And that's probably the main perpetrator in terms of the reasons that he's had to miss the last 2 games, of course. But that was like one of the only games where I really saw, a different sort of style to an extent from this team. We saw the tempo increase a little bit with Luka out. And I'm not saying that they're a better team without Luka. That's not a narrative I'm pushing for by any means, but that was really the only game I kind of learned anything from this team. Just the fact that they can kind of mediate the third ball handling situation a little bit by Kemba minutes on and off, while not overexerting his knee. If they can find a way to do that, while it's not a cure-all, it will definitely help this team drastically. To an extent, it's not going to thrust them into a position of like being top 4 in the West or anything like that. But if you can find a way to implement the Kemba minutes accordingly, and, also as we started to see them doing with Christian Wood, where they're figuring out how to structure his offense within the flow of the offense.
Yeah.
Getting him isolation possessions that aren't forced, that work to, when he's getting the ball on like the strong side, post, or, him moving accordingly with the flow of the ball movement on the floor, things like that, to just get him in the ball in spots where he has the ability to make decisions out of them, whether that be shooting over the top of a guy, posting up, or, of course, trying to pass out of that, and using his ability to work in the short roll in those 4-on-3 situations, and just like the regular pick and roll with Luka. We start to see a lot more, especially since some of their minutes are getting mirrored together a lot more now that they're now Christian Wood's, of course, starting. And, we assume that's going to be something that it ends up being sustained, since they're now starting him over to White. And that's really the only roadblock in his way, with of course, with Maxey out. So, they are starting to figure some things out in terms of, Christian Wood's offensive implementation onto this team, not just having him stand in the corner, which I didn't think that like it was ever that drastic. He was always involved early on the season, but there would be noticeable dry spells where they wouldn't get him the ball for, 5-10 minutes, and he'd only shoot like 6 field goals on a game. We're not really seeing that right now, which I do think that much is positive. And of course, the whole Kemba situation is really kind of spotty, I guess is the word. It's just like really fluctuating. We don't know what we're going to get out of him. We saw that he still does have the potential to come off the bench and, be a sort of dynamic third ball handler that the Mavericks don't have, and for him, it's just really about the consistency. How much will the knee hold up? And is that an indictment upon the Mavericks front office for, waiting so long to try to mend that issue, to where you have a guy who may only be able to give you something 1 out of every 5 games because of his knee? I mean, obviously, yes, but, we have to analyze the situation that is presented to us, and, we can get more into the front office a little later, but I at least think that those are like 2 positives throughout this stretch. Otherwise, the injuries piling up and everything amidst all these games, and Luka having to carry such a heavy load, definitely kind of scares me, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think one thing that through these last 10 games that we've gotten to see is a lot of different lineups. We've seen Frank inserted into the lineup. I mean, heck, we got to see Theo Pinson checked in the first quarter. I just, especially with these injuries happening as of late, yeah, like we're having to see a much different Mavericks team. Now, can we build off that is the big question. We're finding a way to win games. We're on a three-game win streak. Now, insert Dorian. Once we get Josh back, insert him. Maxey will probably be back at the end of the season. But, once we get these guys back, can we build off that? That's the big thing. I think Jason Kidd has finally opened up his arsenal in terms of players. It's not just this boring 9-man rotation. We're getting to see Frank Ntilikina, assuming he's healthy, play a solid. And honestly, I think he's played pretty good these last 10 games, I should say. But yeah, we're seeing the roster sort of opened up in a sense.
No, 100%. We're kind of getting a full look at every player on this roster for the first time this season, right? We really never got to see, especially with Frank, battling some injuries at the first part of the year. I think that is something positive that we're getting to see through this stretch. We're getting to see if there's anything at the back half of the roster that can really help us, right? We've seen some Jaden Hardy minutes. Obviously he's battling a back contusion right now. They kind of just recently got over. So, McKinley Wright played over him the last 2 games. We'll see if that changes at all and fluctuates, but there are some open opportunities for some guys to come in, and prove themselves to an extent. Now, how noteworthy those guys are, or how much they're actually going to be able to fill a role that some of these guys that are injured have left them. That's obviously debatable because, it's not like we're asking Frank Ntilikina to come in here and provide 30 minutes of excellent, tertiary ball handling and insane 3-point shooting and defense. That's obviously wildly unrealistic, but can any of those guys at least show you something, especially those younger guys, to where they can be implemented in the rotation at some point this year? I think that's a fairly provocative question because we can all agree probably that, Jaden Hardy, for instance, or even Frank to a somewhat of an extent, right? They have, maybe they obviously have a ways to go in terms of their development in the NBA. And, obviously I preface this saying with Hardy has much more potential than Frank. And I don't know how much longer Frank's shelf life is, for instance, but we can agree that, he still has a ways to go before, Frank could reach his potential peak, which who knows if he'll actually reach it. But, can any of those guys basically show you something to where they would elevate themselves into playing regular minutes in the rotation? I think is a good question.
Yeah, I think with these injuries, we just mentioned it pretty much. It opens up a spot for these guys. Jaden Hardy, unfortunately, is battling a back contusion. He's just coming back from that. And then again, I mean, Frank battling, what is it, like ankle soreness or something like that. Mm-hmm. But granted with that, these last, or I guess like the 7 games before that, I, especially with Frank more so, I think we got to see some more like valuable minutes with him. I know as his game sort of progressed throughout the season, we got to see him a little more, and I'm not gonna lie, I really liked what I saw out of him. But yeah, seeing Jaden Hardy get inserted a little more, I know he's having that little back injury, but hopefully he comes back healthy from there. And not to like sort of say, but like this New York game coming up, I think is going to be a big save because Frank could be out again. I think Jaden Hardy is on the active roster. Like I feel like, we could see these guys sort of get more of an elevated role through as the season progresses, especially with the injuries that we've seen as of lately.
Yeah, no, most definitely. It'll be really interesting. Obviously this isn't what this podcast is really about, but to kind of highlight the New York game coming up tonight, it'll be really interesting to obviously see Brunson's return, the fanfare reaction to all that sort of stuff. And just to see how I kind of am really interested to see how the dynamic is between him and Luka, like if they ever get matched up between each other, how that's going to play out. So that'll be a fun game. We will actually be in attendance at that game. For any of you guys that would like to meet us, just let us know. We can definitely link up. We're excited to go get a look at the brand new Dirk statue.
Yeah, that'll be cool.
But nonetheless, I'd say overall throughout these last 10 games, despite sort of the injuries that have prevailed and the kind of like weird dynamics that have, Jason Kidd's kind of had to implement by playing this back half of the roster, I'd say that it's probably like, I'm not going to say a net positive, but I don't think it's a net negative. I think it's like somewhere in that, in that equal medium where it's kind of just like, it's like we're 5-5, like 500. We treaded water, right? Like the Mavericks did what they had to do. You can't really complain, but at the same time, like a lot of these wins are very, like obscure and ugly. So I don't think that, one should be overtly optimistic, but I also don't think one should be overtly pessimistic throughout these last 10 games would be my brief summation. I guess next up, let's go ahead and get into some trade target teams that you kind of have penciled in. I'm going to let you go off with a couple teams first. And we're not necessarily going to be, you can list players from the team, of course, but we're not going to get into like specific fake trade packages. We may do that in maybe another week or two. We'll have a podcast like that. But this one specifically, I kind of just, want you to list some teams that you think might be sellers and some teams that you think the Mavericks might be able to pounce on here in the next coming weeks until the trade deadline is ensuing. So
yeah,
I have a couple teams in mind, of course. So let's see if you steal any of mine. Who do you kind of have first up on the agenda?
I think one team, and I mean, this is pretty obvious, but one team to definitely keep an eye on is for sure Chicago. They're in like a really unique situation. I know the sort of disconnect between front office and players and even coaching staff for that matter. And they've openly talked about this. It's just a really, intricate situation. I know a guy that, Mavericks fans have been pining for has been Zach LaVine. He's gotten off to a rocky start. But if the Mavericks are looking to make a second star sort of trade to come next or to pair next to Luka, Zach LaVine, like Chicago's in a weird situation. I know he's sort of this odd man out on that team. I mean, it doesn't hurt to look there. You know, they have plenty of guards on their roster. That's sort of a need that the Mavericks need, or the Mavericks have. Chicago's an interesting situation. We'll see what happens. Again, I know they're not ready to blow up that roster yet. I feel like we could be asking these same questions by All-Star break, but who knows? And then, you know, I think going down the line here, Toronto, they've sort of built something the last few games. So we'll see, you know, if they really are interested. But I don't think the Mavericks can really get in on this. This is sort of, I mean, this definitely is a tipping the meter sort of trade. OG Anunoby. I just don't think the Mavericks have the assets. I know we'll get into the asset sort of management later. But yeah, you know, Toronto, I think Charlotte's a big one. I mean, even Detroit.
No, yeah. I mean, I think the Toronto situation is interesting because
Yeah,
look at their record and they've kind of had some of their different guys be injured throughout different stretches of the year, but they're 15th and 18. So, I mean, barely treading water into that play-in situation right now as the 10th seed. Yet they have so many intriguing players that if they end up becoming sellers, that I think any team in the league would be happy to pounce on. I mean, you look at Gary Trent Jr., OG, of course. I mean, you know, you really have to think that probably the only untouchable guy there for sure, like definitively, is Scotty Barnes. Now,
yeah.
I would definitely say that they would be hesitant to just completely blow it all up and trade like Van Vliet and Siakam and all those guys and Boucher. But you never know if they really just start to stink it up. And, you know, Masai, he's a very decisive GM and he's just like, hey, like, let's enter Tank Dome. Then hey,
He's prepared to do it. He's done it before. So
exactly. But I would definitely monitor that, but I don't think anything's like imminent in terms, maybe besides OG being traded at some point. And I don't think the Mavericks have the assets to get him any longer, you know, as they maybe did like a year or two ago. So that like I said, that's an interesting situation to monitor, but I wouldn't get my hopes up for them. I thought the point that you made about Chicago is really good because I mean they're 14 and 19 and they're, you know, obviously dealing with this Lonzo Ball injuries gave them some trouble, but there definitely seems to be like kind of a disconnect there between Zach LaVine, the coaching staff, and they, you know, just their personnel should not be performing this well. There has to be some sort of disconnect there between the players and the coaching staff. It's a really weird situation. I really do think, you know, I don't know if they're quite at, you know, we're going to blow this up right now yet, but if this kind of persists, you know, they are, let's see, they're 3-7, or no, they're 5-5 in their last 10 games. So if they end up kind of going to the trade deadline and this continually persists, of course, I think we could see some issues arise in that Chicago organization, and they may actually become sellers. So I think that that's like honestly one of the most prominent Eastern Conference teams right now that might be a seller that the Mavericks could pounce on. You know, obviously, I would definitely look at Kobe White first as a guy who might be the odd man out there in terms of
Alex Caruso. I mean,
Alex Caruso, maybe, even though he's
been balling out, but
no, he has. I mean, any team could use his presence as a, you know, a ball handler off the bench who can defend 1 through 3. I mean, he's a invaluable role player, right? But I don't know if things really do blow up. I mean, do they make that sort of penultimate Zach LaVine trade? But you know, what do you do with DeRozan at that point? There's a lot of kind of weird questions that I think there that you can stem off with the Bulls, but nonetheless, I do think that they have to be monitored nonetheless. What's actually kind of funny here looking at the standings is that the Nets are quietly number 3 in the Eastern Conference. I did not realize this.
They 8 in a row, or maybe 9 now.
Ben Simmons is sort of kind of figuring it out. I mean, they're the top 5 in the East are really good.
Yeah.
I think next up, a good pivot point, you know, because of the whole Nate McMillan situation as of recently, I think, you know, since we're just going to keep churning out these Eastern Conference teams, the Atlanta Hawks was my first pick. I think we do 4. Let's do 4 teams from each conference, right?
4. Okay. So
my third. So we each do 2 for each conference.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, 2 for each conference. Okay.
The West is going to be a bit tougher because everybody's trying to compete, but the East I think has some more sellers. But yeah, the Hawks are one game above 500 right now. They're 17-16, and there has been some beef with Trae Young and Nate McMillan, and the just that dynamic has apparently been sort of off kilter this year for whatever reason. They have like one of the better on paper teams in the league, you'd think, and their depth is insane, but I mean, things just seemingly aren't working out with them. You know, that John Collins has been in trade rumors, as he basically is every other week of every season since like 2019. But they just have like a really, I mean, yeah, just like kind of the Bulls to an extent. They just have some like weird organizational disconnects here, to where their team on paper is really good, even better than the Bulls. And I mean, they are in the playoff race, so I would hesitate to say that they're just going to blow everything up. I think that's a little overblown. I think the Hawks are less likely to, trade Trae Young and just completely throw shit, jump ship like everybody's kind of saying. But if, this internal beef with him and Nate McMillan is really as bad as it is, could they become sellers at some point? There's a lot of intriguing guys when you kind of get intricate with it, that you can look on the Hawks and be like, oh, you could package this with Trae Young. I think it would take some sort of huge conglomerate from the Mavericks to even, surmise a package that would even be considering to the Hawks GM to even look at. I don't know his name off the top of my head. I think it's like Travis Shank or something like that.
I actually don't know.
I'd have to check it up. You need to look that up for me.
Okay, gotcha.
But yeah, I mean, it's really weird sort of discourse kind of going on there around Atlanta, and they have some interesting narratives that are coming out. So I mean, if they really start to go on a skid here and they don't figure it out by the trade deadline, we definitely could see the Hawks become huge sellers in a way at that point. Because they're obviously kind of treading water right now at 500, very fairly similar position to the Mavericks in terms of record. But if they really start to drop and they go on a skid, who knows what could happen, and what's to become of Trae Young and John Collins or whoever else you want to kind of put in tandem with those guys in a trade package. But needless to say, there are going to be a lot of buyers if any of those guys go on the market.
Yeah, you by the way, you did get the general manager.
Oh, what's his actual? I think I lost his last name.
Travis Schlenk, I think.
Schlenk. Okay, let's go.
Yeah. So I guess like we both in tandem listed Chicago, and then you listed Atlanta. I know I mentioned like Detroit.
I was going to say Detroit for my last. I just didn't hear you say that.
Okay, well I didn't. I mentioned them. But I'll go. My last team that I'll go in depth with, I think New York. The Knicks, that being.
Really? Yeah. No, I can see that.
So the Knicks, I know. They recently, was it a 7 or 8 game win streak? They followed that up. I'm pretty sure they're like on a 4-game losing streak now. Now, are they going to blow up their roster? I don't think so. I don't think they're anywhere near that. This is pretty much a win now season. But with that being said, you look at the guys that are sort of out of their rotation: Evan Fournier, Derrick Rose. If you want to reach, or not reach, but you can list Cam Reddish there too. And then if you want to take a reach, if you have a good enough package, maybe Emmanuel Quickley is on their list. I just think, New York is in an interesting situation. I don't think Quickley would be on the trade block at all. But with these past few games, maybe it doesn't hurt to, get some guys in return for Derrick Rose or Cam Reddish, because seemingly these last 10, 15 games, Derrick Rose and Cam Reddish, that being, have pretty much fallen completely out of their rotation.
Yeah, the one thing with the Knicks is that, specifically with Quickley, is that I know that there had been reported by some of the Knicks guys that they're seeking a first-round pick for him, right? So, I mean, I don't know. You kind of weigh, if you're getting any of those veterans in terms of Rose or who's the other guy you mentioned?
Cam Reddish or Evan Fournier.
Okay, well, yeah, Rose or Fournier obviously won't cost you any picks. Reddish maybe might cost you a second or something like that. That's definitely, if the Knicks continue to slide, they were just on an 8-game win streak. Now they're on a 3-game losing streak, but I don't know. I think that to an extent they are trying to build something. I could see them maybe ridding themselves. I think they are also a team that has moves to be made.
Exactly.
Just with the back half of their roster kind of being out of the rotation when you talk about Rose and Reddish. But those are, also guys that, if they're not playing for the Knicks, why would they play for the Mavs? You can, pose that question, of course. But in my opinion, both of those guys would have, they could serve contributive roles to an extent on this team. And, Reddish is at least another wing that you can take a flyer on, a former, high lottery pick who's, uber athletic and has great measurables. So, I mean, there's definitely there's some credence to the fact that could work out. But, it's just funny with Atlanta and New York. It's like, would they deal with the Mavericks again after the weird sort of pass of the KP and the Luka for Trey swap? So that's kind of interesting to monitor. And, lastly, like Detroit, there's not a whole ton of guys that, you really look at there, but, just some of those veteran guys that maybe they might be looking to do right by and get them out of there by the deadline just to, clear some space, maybe take back an expiring from the Mavs, like a Dwight Powell or something like that. In a second or something like that. You could look at Nerlens, of course. You get a rim protector, an actual one to pair, with Christian Wood, and of course with the maxi minutes being very up and down amidst his injury history and his right hamstring tear right now. That's something that's kind of sorely needed, especially because Maxi's not like a quote unquote rim protector. He's like a weak side help defender who also is, a good on ball defender. Nerlens is a pretty like traditional rim protector or weak side kind of one. Nerlens does have a tendency with his slender man frame, his hot dog frame rather, to get bodied at times. But that's something that you could look at. Alec Burks is a guy that always comes up in trade deadline discussions, serviceable scorer off the bench, especially if the Mavericks were already like ship off Hardaway and some other deal. That I could see that being an option. And then of course Bojan Bogdanovic, who at this point might cost a pick, but I mean that definitely elevates you into another echelon. You add a little bit of, you added up probably a slightly above average defender. Sure, he's about 33 or whatever it is, but another guy who can go create his own shots. You're tending to that issue even more so. You have him and Kemba at that point. The third ball handler thing becomes a lot more redundant, and you're really at that point only missing a rim protecting big and probably another wing defender. So that may elevate the Mavericks to win another round or get past that play-in echelon. I don't think it would really surprise me if the Mavericks have the feasibility to be able to make a trade that, elevates them past play-in realm or like the 6th seed, for instance. I don't know if they have a move of that sorts, and that's kind of what I want to get into next. But we'll knock off some of these Western Conference teams since we're kind of dragging this out a little longer, that we could see being able to make a move with the Mavericks. I don't think there's like a whole lot versus
I really don't think there is
Eastern Conference, but one team to definitely look at is or really off the top, I'd say probably 2 teams to look at are just Minnesota and Utah. Utah, of course, because they're obviously playing marginally better than they were expected to. So if they've been 5-5 in their last 10, if they continue to kind of slide a little bit more and they, cross under that 500 threshold, I could definitely see that some of their veterans becoming expendable at the trade deadline en route for, Danny Ainge trying to get some picks. We've talked about them since the summer. I feel like that's very self-explanatory. They obviously have had a, great developmental season for some of their younger guys, and Sexton and Markkanen. And, Markkanen's playing at almost an all-star level right now, but, currently they are in the play-in realm. They're 9th, 2 seeds behind the Mavericks. But if they continue to skid a little bit, I could see them being an applicable option. And then, of course, Minnesota, if things are like really just as bad as they seem there, and they continue to just be this sub 500 team, they're 16-18 right now, and they just can't figure it out by the deadline. I mean, who all becomes available at that point? I know I've seen some Mavs fans, mention Anthony Edwards. He's the youngest guy out of that whole bunch in that roster. I would hesitate to think that they would just give him up. I think he's the last guy of all those guys that they would probably give up. And they just signed Gobert to a new deal, so I don't know if they'd probably. I just kind of heavily doubt that they would be willing to part ways with him so fast after trading basically their whole roster for him, just from an asset management perspective. But you look at some guys like, D'Lo, maybe he's been playing fairly well this season. And of course, Cat, like what could you get for him? There's some compelling things there, but I just don't know if the Mavericks really necessarily have the assets to get in on it. barring that, it's like, you're looking at the West and, you see Denver, New Orleans, Memphis, the Clippers, the Suns. Those are not teams that the Mavericks would get in on necessarily with a trade, unless it's something very minute and, something that just really is applicable to, the back end of your rotation, because those are all buyers, right? And even the Kings, surprisingly, at 17-14, unless they kind of go on a skid here. I know that it was announced yesterday that Sabonis has a thumb injury.
Yeah, thumb injury.
Yeah. So, that could maybe be a team that ends up becoming a seller at some point. But right now, I would say that they probably don't project as one. I'd say they're
probably
playoffs. The Trailblazers, I think, are still trying to be competitive, even though they're, the same record as the Mavericks. I don't think the Warriors are going to become sellers, because when Curry gets back, they're going to continue to go. The Thunder, some of these teams at the bottom of the West. Well, I checked that. I see.
I got
here at the bottom actually kind of intrigued me a little bit more.
Yeah, I was about to say, I got one team that's 14 or 13. That's being the Houston Rockets. Like, I just think,
I completely forgot about Eric Gordon and that.
That's I was about to say. I was like, that's just one situation you have to monitor is Eric Gordon. I don't know if that's the type of guy that the Mavericks are really looking for, but again, that's a guy that can create his own shot.
Tends to the defensive issues, especially at the point of attack. The Mavericks don't really have a guy like under 6'5" that can kind of go point guards like that. He's lost a little bit of his lateral quickness in his age, but he would be a really interesting piece to implement on our roster. Of course, I think, you have a pretty solid little group of wings at that point when you have, Green, Gordon, Finney-Smith, and Bullock. You have like 4 guys that you can kind of throw at different guys offensively, based on, what their position is and what have you. You use like Green and Gordon more as your point of attack defenders. You use Finney-Smith and Bullock to defend, those high-powered, point forwards like a LeBron and Jason Tatum, for instance, things like that, right? So that would be interesting if the Mavericks could pull something like that. But besides that, there's really nobody on that Rockets roster that I think Kenyon Martin Jr. or was KJ Martin.
KJ Martin or no, it's Kenyon.
Kenyon Martin Jr.
I feel like, if you're looking for minute details off the bottom of your bench, like that's
he's a solid wing.
Yeah.
He's a little bit older than some of I think that's the reason he's been mentioned some trade talks. He's, I think, like 25, 26, something like that. So obviously I know Rockets fans have kind of been on the fast track to be like, oh, he's not in the under 24 club. Let's try to get him out of here. We need to let, Tari Eason and blah, 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 and all these guys develop. So, that could maybe be a thing. But besides, I don't see too much from the Rockets. The Spurs, we obviously the dream scenario, you could be able to fleece a Devin Vassell or a Keldon Johnson. But, the more and more I think about it, it's just like those guys I feel like, even though they are a little bit older, like they'll still fit the timeline of whoever they're able to get to an extent. And they're just too good and too young for them to really give up on.
Well, they're young and they're also losing, and that's what they need right now. So
yeah, exactly. And one team that just came to mind, this is in the East, actually. I think that kind of covers the West. I think we could both agree. Is actually the Hornets, because with them sliding, they're 9-25. They're almost certainly, they're in some deep water right now. Miles Bridges potentially coming back. So that's an interesting team to monitor. In terms of Gordon Hayward, Rozier. There's some names there. I don't know, what the Mavericks assets and their feasibility to go get any of those guys would look like. But I definitely think that, I've posted a couple fake trades with them, and that could definitely be a team. But barring that, I don't see, maybe Washington or maybe Washington or Orlando. But it's like, how many of those guys are they really looking to sell? Maybe like a Kuzma. I don't know. You have to start kind of stretching it in terms of guys that are actually going to be on the market. Orlando with Jonathan Isaac, but he's been out for so long at this point. Do you want to venture in that direction? And, there's obviously some concerns regarding, his personality type with some fans and what have you. So, I don't know. It's a really weird situation to monitor. But I would definitely say that those teams that we listed off the top in the Eastern Conference And those two teams we listed in the West, in the Jazz and probably the Wolves, and I guess throw the Rockets in there too. Those kind of 7 teams are probably the most applicable teams that the Mavericks should probably trade with. Yeah,
I think maybe like the most dark horse sort of pickups would be maybe a Dylan Brooks. I don't think
he'd be available.
I don't think he'd be available, but I think offered, and this is probably out of the Mavericks realm, but offered a good enough package. I feel like I don't know. I just don't think he really fits their sort of scheme that they want. I think he's sort of like that odd man out on that roster. And he's honestly had a pretty rough start to the season.
So what do you think that the Grizzlies would be pining for in return?
That I don't know. They
like
pretty much have,
guys.
Yeah, I was about to say, I was like, they pretty much have like every hole in their roster filled. But Dylan Brooks, he offers a good sense of defense, of course. But in the sense that he's Tim Hardaway, he just likes to jack up every shot. I think he's like averages close to like 18 shots a game, I want to say.
What's his efficiency look like this year? Because it's been like
I'm actually not sure. Here, I'll look this up real quick. But I do know he's been shooting inefficient for at least I feel like most of the season.
Yeah, he's a guy that I think, and when he kind of came into the league, he kind of bared the label of being sort of this 3-and-D wing. But now he's like this defensive wing who maybe one can argue, tries to do too much on offense sometimes, right?
Yeah,
but he still get the defensive intangibles, and if it's a situation where the Mavericks are getting rid of Hardaway already in another trade, or they're doing a swap like that, that's something I could see being applicable. But I still think that I don't know if he's like
I don't think he's on their
they would
block
sell
at
him
all.
to the Mavericks, but I mean it depends on what they got in return, I guess.
Yeah, they would definitely need a good package in return. But so far this season, he's played 29 games, 41% from the field and 34% from 3.
Yeah, so those are kind of definitely more abysmal numbers than we've seen from him in his career, but he was battling some injury stuff earlier in the year. So I mean there's optimism to think that he might be able to turn it around. And I personally don't know exactly what the Grizzlies want, but if I'm presuming, based on kind of what I've watched a little bit and what you've told me, they're probably looking for more stability at that position. A guy who they can just rely on to
Tim Hardaway
shoot the threes when he's open. No, Tim Hardaway's like
no, it's a joke.
Yeah. But like maybe like Reggie, if he's able to positively continue to regress as he does every winter from 3. Dare I say Dorian? I don't know how much I'd be willing to give that up, but those are some guys I feel like they could be interested in, maybe in terms of you do kind of a swap with Brooks and you get maybe 2 guys that are more stable from 3, and because they do have some creation outside of Ja with Tyus Jones, who's a really good point guard off the bench, and Desmond Bain can work off the dribble some, but I still think that they're also at the same time trying, that D'Anthony Melton's a guy they kind of sorely missed.
Yes.
So that's a really weird situation to monitor. I mean, I'd be interested to see if he gets shipped at all, but I do think they kind of need him to an extent. But if they're looking to go more towards that stability, those one-dimensional players that we always talk about for the Mavericks, and they want to get more one-dimensional. Mavericks want to get less one-dimensional, essentially. And they can have Reggie Bullock, but that's an interesting team you brought up. Now next I kind of want to segue into the archetype of a player that the Mavericks, would be trying to get right. Like, do they need another ball handler at this point? Do they need another 3-and-D wing, with some creation ability, or do they need a rim protecting big? Like, what is the archetype that you think is most essential? Because I think those 3 that I just listed off are probably all needs for the Mavericks to some sort of extent. But if you're ranking them on the totem pole, which would you put first in terms of needed most and last in terms of needed least?
I definitely think a playmaker is probably top. I just think the Mavericks are sorely in need of someone who can create their own shot and at a consistent level. With Kemba Walker, with the addition of Kemba Walker, he's sort of taken a little weight off the shoulders of Luka in that sense. But then again, can you rely on Kemba Walker for 5 games out of 5 games? We just haven't seen that. He's done an amazing job for every other game, every 3 games that he's played. But with that being said, is his knee going to stay healthy? So I just think, the Mavericks could look in a more consistent role. And that would probably be a second star, the Terry Rozier. Honestly, that's the only name that really comes up to my head that can a Bojan.
Which
when
you say second star, you mean more like,
or not second star,
yeah.
but I just think someone who's would be the second star on this team. Not saying they're a star, but they would be the second best player.
Yeah, I mean, I think Christian Wood, the way he's been playing, obviously elevates himself into an echelon where he can you can argue against some of those guys. But I mean, on that sort of level, second or third best player of the team, even if it's not moving the needle to.
Here, I'll put it this way: someone that moves Spencer to the bench. I'll put it that way.
Oh, okay. So you're saying you're going the creator route still.
Yeah, creator. Yeah, someone who can create their own shot, someone who can create their own offense, and shoot at a consistent level. I just think Tim Hardaway, if you're talking about shooting alone, I just don't think he's consistent. We saw him shoot. What did he have? 28 points on Christmas Day.
26.
26. Okay, so 26 on Christmas Day. We'll see that every other game, and then we'll see a dud of 8 points. I just think consistent shooting, someone who can again create their own shot, and again, as I listed, Terry Rozier, he's definitely a guy that I would monitor. If you're going the second star route, a Trae Young, that would be a huge shakeup in the scheme of the NBA. But I don't know, how readily, we talked about this, but how readily the Hawks would be able to do that. But yeah, I just think I think that's probably the top need. And then next, I would probably go towards the route of the rim protector. With the emergence of Josh Green, I just probably wouldn't put 3-and-D wing as high as a rim protector. And with JaVale McGee pretty much, dudding out this season, I wouldn't put him even in the roster. We saw everybody pretty much play on Christmas Day, and he was the only guy that didn't play. So I think if we went down the Nerlens Noel route, that would definitely shift. I don't think it would shift the meter at all. I don't think we'd win an X amount of games because of him, but I think, the team would definitely be better.
No, yeah, I completely agree. Was some of your takes there, but I will push back in terms of the order. Honestly, my order is yours, but literally reversed. I do see what you're saying there, but I think I'm more keen to defense on the wings, just in terms of I look at one of the best teams in the league, my sort of idealistic model, a team that I always look to that is the sort of threshold, for a contender is the Boston Celtics. And they have all these dynamic ball handlers and guys that can play defense. You look at Derek White, Marcus Smart, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum. Obviously all those, Matt Brogdon, all those guys can defend 1 through 3, in Tatum and Brown's case, they can defend 4s at times too. I don't know. I'm just very keen to defense, and I feel you can never have enough point of attack and wing defenders, right? I think that the Mavericks are still one away from really having a nice assortment of them. They have a solid little rotation when everybody's healthy, when you have Green, Finney-Smith, and Bullock, but I think they're just one consistent point of attack / wing defender away still. So I and I think, by saying that, I'm not saying a strict 3-and-D wing. I still want a guy who has some sort of, pseudo creation ability, can attack off some closeouts, can able to create his own shot, the sort of archetype player I would probably try to attest to in terms of this. And this is not a guy that I think the Mavericks could get by any means, but a DeAndre Hunter or Patrick Williams, when he starts hitting his ceiling, guys like that is that's the model archetype player that I would really love for this Mavericks team. A guy that, maybe more on a rookie scale deal too, that could be on the fast track to, they kind of have the 3-and-D aspect of their game down, but they still have the potential to develop that creation and that playmaking ability down the line. Cause that's your idealistic guy you could pair with Luka, right? We talk about guys that you would most to pair with Luka. For me, for instance, SGA is at the top of that list, right? And that's a guy who, he had guard skills coming in, but he's bigger. He's 6'6". He can defend 1 through 3, but can also take a bulk of the scoring off of Luka, of course. He's a, more extreme case. I'm not saying that a guy has to come in and provide that much playmaking or that much shot creation ability, but a guy that can do a little bit of that, at least to a level where it alleviates some of the pressure from Spencer and Dinwiddie and Luka, of course. And at the same time, lock down on defense at the wing position. That would be my idealistic guy. And then I'd probably list the rim protector for all the reasons you said, number 2. And then another ball handler, just because I feel like the Mavericks immediate. That's the one area with the Kemba thing. Like, even if it's not going to be consistent, it is the one area out of those other, like, with the wing and unless AJ Lawson comes in and starts producing, we'll see how that goes. You never know.
Yeah.
He might play tonight, by the way.
Yeah, I know.
With all these injuries. But, unless the ball handler, with the ball handler situation, like, it's been tended to a little bit, right? It's not, it's the only thing that has kind of, had any sort of stopgap measure to been provided for it, right? With the Kemba signing. I mean, now it's not some sort of cure-all by any means, but it does, it is something that helps, right? So, we see with the Mavericks haven't done anything to address their wing or their rim protection problems since the season started. So that's the only reason I would rank it in that order. But, I thought that was really interesting to look at. Next up, I want to kind of get into the next sort of 10 games for the Mavericks, just January stretch. How essential is this, in your opinion, in terms of being a turning point this season, or a downwards turning point this season, or the Mavericks just end up kind of treading water and staying mediocre? Kind of tell everybody what this stretch is going to basically persist of. Like, you of course at the kind of top half of the stretch, it's a little weaker, and then it gets kind of stronger at the end of the stretch. And how are the Mavericks, tentatively and projectively, how do you think they're going to kind of fare in this January stretch? Obviously not just going to go through and like predict game by game, but just looking at this sort of strength of schedule, what do the Mavericks got on their plate coming up?
Yeah, I mean, the Mavericks, I'll start from pretty much tonight, December 27th. This next 4 or 5 games that they have, I think, is definitely easier. And then, the next 5 games after that is probably the toughest stretch in the month of January. I think one thing that we need to look for the Mavericks is, through this injury stretch, would be probably, what can they build on? Building off a win on Christmas would be huge, of course. But, again, I mean, we see how much the Mavericks rely on this 3-and-D. Or not 3-and-D, how much they rely on the 3-point shooting. How much is that going to affect these next few games? How much is that going to affect their January? Can the Mavericks build off of 3-point shooting? That's really the big thing that I would look forward to. I think we'll definitely see Dorian come back. We'll see Josh Green come back here in the next few weeks. I feel like, I would hope that Frank Ntilikina is playing. Hopefully it's not another, what was his injury? Was it like a knee, fusion or whatever it was, or an ankle fusion, whatever his thing was?
Yes. And then Davis had the knee fusion.
Yeah. So hopefully
there's the season, just a fusion central.
Yeah. Hopefully that there's not like some sort of weird nagging injury like that affecting him. But I just think, a sense of, what is this team going to be? Because I feel like, I mean, I don't know how you feel, but I don't feel like this team has found an identity at all, or at least found who they could be.
No, it teeter tots every week.
Exactly. Like, this Christmas to All-Star break stretch is really key for the Mavericks. Sitting at 18-16, they can, I mean, if they win tonight, they're 4 games back of the first seed. Like, they're somehow still in contention. I'm putting air quotes there. Of like,
no, I would.
They're not in contention. They're like somehow teeter-totting on like.
Yeah, because I think there's a clear delegation between the Mavericks and like those top 3 teams.
No, they're okay. You can't compare them. Like,
yeah, so like I would put like I'd put like maybe the label I would put is out of the play-in contention.
Yeah, out of the play-in game.
Getting I don't even know if I'd go home court advantage, but like getting in the 4 through 6 range, like that's still a potential possibility, despite the Mavericks. The Mavericks are 18-16, and it feels like 7 or 8 of these games they shouldn't have won and do not deserve to win. Like that's what scares me. I think is like,
no, I mean,
a lot of these games the Mavericks really have not played up to the ball, and you can argue that they probably didn't go out and win. They just merely escaped.
Yeah, for sure. I think you can make an argument of that. This easy stretch, as you say, of this next few games coming up, I think is going to be like a big say of what this team can be. Because we've seen time and time again that the easy stretches of this season have been the hardest stretches for the Mavericks. So I think if the Mavericks can build some sort of consistency through the next few games, we might have a blueprint of what we can see through the rest of the season. But again, I don't mean to say that they're contending for a top 3 seed or anything like that. I think that they can establish themselves as one of the better 6 through 4 seeds, or at least one of the better play-in teams through this January stretch, which would be pretty key. We've seen, 3-game win streaks turn into 4-game losing streaks just like that. So we'll see what we can get. A win against New York is again huge, but this January stretch, I think it's a tough stretch. We play 15 games in 30 days. So I want to say there's 2 back-to-backs in that stretch. So it'll be a tough stretch of games, but nonetheless, I think the most thing I'm looking for is how much of an identity can the Mavericks find?
Yeah, but you also want to look at like, what is the goal? Like if it's another like 6 through 4 season, or like, I'm talking about like the seeding wise, like if they're in that 4 through 6 range, like what's the goal there? Of course, like by you treading water, does that by virtue, still make you viewed as one of the more competent organizations in the league? Does that attract players come the off season? I mean, those are the only like benefits that can come out of that. Or, is that going to, get guys to want to, request trades to you if they're asking out, things like that. Like those are some of the benefits by staying good that you can kind of still obtain. But, if the Mavericks do start to slide, their first round pick is top 10 protected. There's credence to the fact that maybe they should continue to take. Who knows, right?
There's still time.
But, those are compelling arguments to make for either, of course. But, obviously Luka wants to win and stay good. So that's like your main reason for wanting to continue to win regardless of the situation, of course. But yeah, I mean, who knows where we end up finishing, but it is a provocative discussion. And I do think that this stretch really through the All-Star break is really going to define our season. And I mean, you look at this Mavericks roster and we can, kind of toss things up in the air and, project, oh, the Mavericks should do this. I think that, they should be going for this guy, or, this is the team that they're most likely to trade with and all this. But at the end of the day, we have to look at the players in the front office, or, if you just think that's Mark Cuban, you're entitled to that opinion. I get that argument as well, right? If he's just the puppeteer behind all this, right? But nonetheless, like we look at, revisionist history would tell us that, the Mavericks tend to be content when they're good. That's typically not when they're pouncing and trying to make moves, especially in this Luka era where they, they've sort of strangled themselves in terms of their capital that they're going to be able to ship out. They will have all their picks available, coming up after this draft, of course, but nonetheless, like, and if they wanted to renounce if the Knicks agree to renounce the protections on this year's picks, they could have all of them available. There's some different outlets to, be able to ship out 3 first-round picks, of course. But like you look at the capital that this team has, and do they even have the feasibility to make a trade that would put them in that echelon of past that 4 to 6 seed realm where you're just kind of treading water, right? Like I think if they kind of go on a win streak here, like even if we want them to make a move, I think the front office may bear some contentment and be like, okay, like we're fine, like we're winning and we can buy another season to where we can get help for Luka sometime in the off season. Like that's probably their mentality. Like if they're able to kind of just tread water, if they get in that 4 to 6 range out of the play in, like, oh yeah, we're chilling, like we're winning just enough for Luka to be happy and okay. And like, is that the mentality I'd like them to have? No, but that could be what the mentality that is stemming from our front office or Mark Cuban, whoever you think is the perpetrator, right? And there's a real argument to the Mavericks' only route to long-term success being them going on a skid here, them going on a losing streak at the deadline to where they end up having to sell and they end up having to, maybe take back some draft capital or some younger players, some flyers, and ridding of some of their, older one-dimensional role players. I know that this whole point is kind of making everything we talked about earlier in the podcast counterintuitive with our whole sort of, talking about potential trades, potential teams to trade with. But this is sort of the reality of the situation. Like, we can daydream all we want, and it is fun to do that because, there is credence to the fact that maybe one of those things ends up coming to fruition. You never know. And it's fun to project because that's what we do as fans. But we also have to look at the reality of who the players in the front office are, which is a very sad and real reality that we have to kind of look at, right?
No, for sure. I don't think there's anybody that we listed outside, of course, like Trae Young and everything like that, that really, sets the table to put this team in the echelon of contending for a championship. I don't think there's anybody that you can make a trade for this season. Or at least like with the assets that we have available, I just don't think there's anybody that the Mavericks can really do that with. Now, with that being said, no, I am not pining for any injury to happen or anything like that. But the Mavericks, if they did somehow decide to slide, they did somehow decide to keep their top 10 draft pick, because of course that's top 10 protected.
Oh, well, they would get fortunate enough to, because technically they could
we
be
would
the worst team
we would
in the
get the
league,
11th spot.
They could be the worst team in the league and still somehow balls drop and they end up getting the 12th pick or something.
We'd get the 11th spot. No, but it's not too late. Again, I think us, as you mentioned earlier, us as fans, we want to see moves made, but is there any room for moves to be made with this current roster as it's constructed? So only time will tell. We still have a few months until February, or early February approaches, but again, it's coming on us fast. It's coming on. It's quick. So with that being said, contract extensions with Christian Wood, there's so many different stuff that is going to come up before, February 5th or February 3rd, something like that. That coveted trade deadline.
Yeah. And the Mavericks have until basically free agency to extend Christian Wood, as pointed out by CBA Mavs today. I posed that question on Twitter. So, they can do that whenever, but the fact that they didn't offer the extension when it was first available, it definitely may speak volumes to an extent as to, the whole feasibility of him actually either accepting that contract extension or the Mavs just, being cheap and wanting to see how this plays out. Or, this could very well turn into another Brunson situation.
Yeah.
The Mavs do have full bird rights to him, but they had full bird rights with Brunson too. It's just a really weird situation in terms of how they could potentially mismanage another asset, and they're just like, oh, whatever. Because it seems like some of the stuff that's came out of Mark Stein and his Substack and everything, like they don't seem like over the top ready to offer Wood this extension. And I get Christian Wood may not be the most coveted player, asset, or idealistic big man, whatever. But 4 for 77 is a bargain for him. Like, I think that much is clear. And at the very least, you want that from asset management perspective, because then you can trade him down the line. That's a very tradable contract at what help you be making like 19-18 a year and in descending order, something like that, I think. So it bodes you like flexibility to be able to trade it down the year. So it's kind of puzzling to me as to why they don't, really push hard and venture in that direction, especially after the Brunson situation. I get they're different players, but it's the same type of narrative of them losing, basically the second best player on the team for absolutely nothing if this ends up happening. I know Christian Wood likes Dallas, and maybe they think they can re-sign him in the offseason on some sort of bigger figure, but the whole contract extension thing scares me. And I'm in the camp that, I posted this on Twitter, but you just sign him and figure the rest out later, or you decisively ship him by the deadline. One of the two. I would hate to see them lose him for nothing. And some fans are largely content with that if it ends up, bolstering us to another Western Conference Finals or Western Conference semifinals run. Just to get another year of experience for Luka. You make the argument, oh, Wood's expendable. We can always find another guy like him. It's not as much of an asset play as Brunson. You're not losing as much. There are plenty of bigs out there that can do just what he's doing, blah, blah, blah. Who cares if it gets us to, X point in the regular season? But, if you, my argument to those fans would be, if you have a guy that's carrying you to that level, or not carrying you essentially, but, helping aid your roster to get to that Western Conference Finals, type of realm, which I don't think this roster by any means has the ability to do. But I mean, last year's roster surprised us when they turned things around, so you never know.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you want that guy to come back and just add more around that? I don't know. Needless to say is I think that they should pounce on trying to extend him sooner rather than later, or decisively ship him out. I know it's you can make the argument, let's just wait and see how far he can get us in the playoffs before we decide if we want to pay him or not. But I just think they have to be decisive. They can't afford to happen. They can't afford what happened with the Brunson situation to happen again, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think, in terms of trading Christian Wood by deadline, I think if you're looking in terms of positive assets, he's one of the very few positive assets that the Mavericks have attainable at this time. We listed a number of guys that the Mavericks could possibly target, and would Christian Wood fit in whatever team that is? Who knows? But I think I'm more in the boat with you, where figure it out, or sign him and then we'll figure it out later. Sooner rather than later, let's see that happen. But who knows? This Mavericks front office, we've seen time and time again. The twists and turn. And we saw it with the Brunson situation. I hope it's not another Brunson situation where we lose them for nothing. But again, who knows what Mark Cuban and Nico Harrison are deciding up there. Who knows? Maybe they have something in store. I'm pretty much out of that boat now. I could say preseason, I was hoping for a trade, but I think as the season just sort of dwindles on, a trade becomes less and less of an option that I see the Mavericks making.
Yeah, just because they don't have the assets. Not to say that
Exactly.
they wouldn't want to do that, but it's just operating under the parameters of the sort of construct of this team. It's what can they do that's really going to move the needle? If there's a move to be made out there, though, I do hope that they make it. But it's shaping up, in my opinion, to be another disappointing deadline. Is kind of bleak and grim as that is to hear, unfortunately. But we were going to get into our sort of player reviews through the first 34 games of the season, but we kind of ended up realizing just how long this went, that's going to be a pod in itself. I think that's definitely something we need to do halfway through the season, 7 games from now.
Yeah.
At the official halfway point, we'll review how everybody's done so far this season, just because we dragged this one out. But we had some good provocative discussion topics. Really enjoyed this one. We're excited to get this one out, start the YouTube. For those of you guys listening on YouTube, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and plug our podcast platforms now, of course, as we usually do on the podcast. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at mainstream_Mavs, like and subscribe on YouTube now, Mainstream Mavs Podcast. You can find us on YouTube, of course. Comment down below. What should we have them comment down below, Jaren? What is predict Luka Doncic's stat line versus the Knicks tonight as Jalen Brunson comes down to Dallas? If you guys are listening before the Knicks game tonight, predict that for us. We're not doing a preview for that game, but I think the intensity in the stage is kind of set. And I think that I think it's just self-explanatory. It's a game that kind of doesn't need a preview. I know Jalen Brunson's questionable with some hip soreness, but he's a competitor since as long as he's been playing basketball. I think he's going to play. I want to dispel any narratives that he won't play. But yeah, make sure to follow us on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, give us a 5-star rating if you like our content and you deem it applicable. Make sure to follow us on TikTok now. We're now on TikTok.
Yeah.
We're transcending some options. We're on we're Mainstream Mavs on TikTok. Jaren's going to be running that over there. We're going to be posting some clips. I know that may only kind of appeal to the younger audience over here.
We got to attract more.
Yes, we do. We are kind of, if you just want to see little clips and what have you, then definitely go check that out. We'll post sparingly on Instagram too, just kind of plugging up more of our podcast stuff over there. But thank you guys so much for listening. If you've made it this far, we really do appreciate you guys. And thank you for sticking with us. We're excited to get this YouTube stuff starting out and to continue to expand with you guys. So we will catch you guys after the Knicks game tonight. 3 pods in 2 days. Let's run it. We're averaging 1.5 pods per day after the next 2 days. Insane logistics that we're putting up here over at Mainstream Mavs after a week of absence. And we will catch you guys tonight. Had a fun podcast here.
Bye.